A SPADROON is just a chunky small sword. Or at least that's what one sword expert and fellow HEMA aficionado Alan Sherlock says. And lots of people went, no! A SPADROON is not just a thick, chunky boy small sword. It's completely different from that. And I was one of those people. But is he actually wrong? But before I go on, I want to give quick props to Nick Thomas from the Academy of Historical Fencing, AHF, linked to his video below, because he did a really good and in-depth and complete, comprehensive look at what is a SPADROON really. And that's going to go into more depth than I am here. However, I'm going to bring a different aspect to looking at it. I'm also going to question whether my reaction, and indeed Nick Thomas's reaction to Alan Sherlock's assertion that a SPADROON is just a chunky small sword, we both said, no, you're wrong. But is he actually wrong? Well, here's the problem. There are lots of swords that don't fit into neat categories. We love things which fit into neat categories, but they don't always do so. This, pretty much everyone would agree, is a SPADROON. Okay, so is the SPADROON dictated by the design of hilt? Is it dictated by the design of blade? Is it a combination of both? Yes, no, I don't know. SPADROON is one of these terms that comes around, I think it's first used in MacBain's treatise in the 1720s. So it's a term that comes around in the 18th century, but it's certainly not a type of sword that comes around in the 18th century, because it's synonymous with something called the shearing sword, and this is a type of sword that's been around since the 17th century. Nick will go into greater depth on that on his video linked below. But fundamentally, there are types of sword which are not rapiers, which are not really small swords, which are not really broadswords, they're not really backswords, there's something in between all of those things, and they get called shearing swords or SPADROONs. So what we end up with is something like this Napoleonic era SPADROON here, which is fundamentally a narrow backsword. It is predominantly single-edged. It has a little false edge here, but it's got a spine at the back. And if you scaled this up, if you made it a bit broader, you don't even need to make it longer. If you just made it a bit broader, we would call this a backsword. However, there are double-edged varieties. Now, the problem is that if you made it much narrower of that single-edged type, which is not really something you necessarily find, you might call that a small sword. If you made it broader, you'd call it a backsword. If you put it with a shell guard, a shell hilt, that makes no difference. This might have a simple knuckle bow and D guard of a type that's popular in the late 18th century from about 1760 onwards. But often, for example, with the 1796 pattern, we get a double shell guard, and that's a type of guard that's been around since the 17th century. And of course, a simple D guard, you could say, has been around since the 15th century, because you find them on falchions. So we have to disregard the hilt. The hilt design is almost irrelevant here. So if we're only talking about the blade, what defines a SPADROON blade? Is it just a cut and thrust sword that's narrower than an average cut and thrust sword? Maybe. But look, here's the problem. So this is a typical, and very nice, silver-hilted English small sword from the 1720s. So this is around the time that Donald MacBain is writing his manual. And this is a typical, or well, it's not actually a typical, but it's a small sword of a type that is quite iconic and well known. That is, it's a triangular section blade, and it's collier-schmad, so it's broader at the base. It has no ability to cut whatsoever because the blade section is hollow ground triangle. It is only a very effective thrusting implement, purely for stabbing, cannot cut with it. However, here's the problem. Not all small swords are like that. Here's another small sword, which we could term a military small sword. And this, you'll notice, has a double-edged blade that's not that slim at the base, but it is very slim up here. So this is essentially like a really narrow broadsword blade on a hilt, which is a shell hilt, double shell hilt of a type that's often found on small swords, but equally often found on SPADROONs. So what the hell is this thing? Is this a SPADROON? Is it a small sword? Do we make up a new term, military small sword? I don't know. It's a military sword probably. It's a German sword probably carried by a German officer in the middle of the 1700s. But this is a sword that's intended to be carried in war that fulfills all of the same functions as a spadroon. It's a little bit narrower than a Napoleonic spadroon. As you can see, it's quite a bit narrower. But does that make it a small sword? I don't know. I don't know what to call this. Military small sword, spadroon, I don't know. And here we've got a sword at other end of the spectrum. So this is showing an early type of small sword with essentially a rapier type blade. Very, very narrow blade with a cross section. It's double-edged with a fillet in this point and then essentially square section beyond this. So this has no real cutting capacity whatsoever. It's essentially a scaled down rapier blade, and initially this is what small swords were. When small swords came into existence, small swords were just scaled down rapiers. That's why they were called small swords, because they're like a sword but smaller. The sword at the time, the typical sword being a rapier. And you'll notice again this has got the typical double shell guard as found on numerous small swords and many types of spadroon as well. So given that this is double-edged, and it does have a form of edge, even though it's not really going to cut much, does that make that a spadroon? I think most people would agree, no, it's an early small sword. However, it is edged. It's not the triangular bladed small sword. It's not the thrust only, well, rather completely unedged small sword. It does have a form of edges that's like a very narrow and scaled down rapier. So that's a small sword, I think most people would agree. Definitely people would agree that the triangular blade is a small sword. This one, I don't know. What do you think? Post in the comments below. Do you think this is now a spadroon? Is it a small sword? I'd be interested to know what Nick's view is, what Alan's view is. Get posting in the comments down below. Is this a small sword? Is this a spadroon? Is it a shearing sword? Is it something else? I don't know. Complicating further, we want to illustrate some other things as well. So I've got a couple of swords here that are both 17th century, so we're keeping it quite early. First of all, we've got something here that would be sometimes referred to as, it's a bit like a walloon hilt. It's not actually a walloon hilt. It's more of an English form, and it's not really quite a mortuary hilt. It's something that came after that. But you'll notice it has a double shell guard. It has a sort of ribcage like guard at the front that's quite similar or derived from earlier mortuary hilts. And then it has a broadsword blade. So I think we could categorically call this a broadsword. But you will notice, if I compare it to the Napoleonic spadroon, it's not really much broader. It's double-edged. This one's single-edged, but we've already established that a spadroon can be single-edged or double-edged. So in this case, it's only about 1 inch longer, and it's only, you know, maybe, I don't know, at most a centimetre at the base wider. But at the tip, the irony is if we actually look at the cutting portion of the blade up here, it's no wider at all. So the problem is, what is that? What do we call it? Is that a broadsword? Is that a spadroon? I don't know. We're not going to call it a spadroon because it's got shell guards on it, definitely. But by the blade alone, I think it's a little bit narrow to call a broadsword. And it's really extremely similar to something that we definitely call a spadroon. So if we definitely agree this is a spadroon, why isn't this a spadroon? Again, comments and answers down below. Here we've got another sword of the 17th century. You'll recognise this from my wall in my study usually. And again, we'd normally call this a form of broadsword, I guess. However, again, the blade isn't very broad. It is certainly broader at the base than the spadroon. However, again, if we look at the actual region of the blade where you're actually hitting someone with, it's not really. Yes, it's double-edged, but again, double-edged, it can still be a spadroon, be double-edged. So is this a broadsword? Is this a spadroon? Would Donald MacBain have regarded this, which could have still existed in his time, would he have regarded this, or would he have regarded this as broadswords, and not as backswords because they're double-edged? Would he have regarded them as broadswords, or would he have regarded them as shearing swords or spadroons? I don't know. And then when we get later into the 19th century, it gets even more complicated. I've made this argument before with the French 1882 cannula blade here. This is in fact a pre-1882. This is a Army of North Africa officers non-regulation sword. But you can see it's a very narrow blade. It's quite thrust-centric. It's actually quite stiff, this, and it is double-edged. But actually, if we compare it to the spadroon, it's extremely similar in silhouette. And if anything, this slightly more specialised thrusting sword, the French infantry officer's sword here, is actually slightly narrower than the Napoleonic spadroon that we definitely agree is a spadroon. Again, just picking another example randomly, this is actually a Prussian cuirassier's sword. I'm putting it out here. That's also a relatively narrow blade. This one's now back-edged, so this is, you could say, a form of backsword. I think functionally it is pretty much like a backsword. It's got a basket hilt, it's got a single-edged blade. But again, if we compare it with the Napoleonic spadroon, it's only a shade broader. I mean, only a tiny bit, and it's only a little bit longer. It's only about a centimetre longer. So again, comparing side by side, we know that this is a cavalry sword. Not only is this a cavalry sword, this is a heavy cavalry sword. This is a cuirassier's sword. So is that a spadroon? Is it a palash? I think most people would say it's a palash, but it's a palash that's only a tiny bit longer and a tiny bit broader than a spadroon. So, to conclude, what is a spadroon? Have we moved any closer to an answer? I think the answer is probably no. I want to thank Nick Thomas and Alan Sherlock for driving this kind of, I don't know, debate or kind of research forwards. And I think the etymology is very interesting as well. And we need to drill back a little bit and see if we can find more in early texts where the spadroon is referred to. That might give us some hints for what a spadroon was to them. What was a shearing sword to them? How was a shearing sword different to a backsword or a broadsword? I don't know. And you know, is this a spadroon? Which, you know, you could call a militarized small sword. Is that a spadroon? I don't know. I think we'll all agree that is a spadroon. Is the French 1882 and what came before it, the North African Army non-regulation swords, are they spadroons? I don't know. And these 17th century swords, are they broadswords? Are they spadroons? Are they shearing swords? I don't know. So answers down below. But I look forward to seeing Alan and Nick Thomas's responses to this if they come, or just, you know, in the comments even. So if you guys watch this, I'd love to see you commenting down below here. It's a complicated subject, but a fun one. As always, I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really, really soon. Check out those links below. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.